Let's vote, vote, vote. It's time to vote.
From Bollywood celebrities to ordinary citizens, Indians cast their votes in the fourth phase of the nation's mammoth election. Who will lead the world's largest democracy? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. A battle royale in Indian politics. On one side, the son of a tea vendor, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, seeking re-election after serving 5 years in office. On the other end, the scion of a political dynasty, the Congress Party's Rahul Gandhi, looking to reclaim his family's legacy. At stake, a stagnant economy, unemployment, national security, and the future of more than 1 billion Indian citizens. Here's a look at India's election by the numbers. Some 900 million people are registered to vote for candidates to fill 543 seats in the lower house of parliament. Voting began in early April, with the final ballot cast more than 5 weeks later on May 19th. Results are expected to be announced on the 23rd of May. Well, there's lots to talk about. Let's get to our panel. With us here in Washington is Irfan Nooruddin, Professor of Indian Politics and Faculty Chair at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Also on set, Sunil Khilnani. He's author of Incarnations, A History of India in 50 Lives. Joining us from New Delhi is Subramanian Swamy, a member of the upper house of the Indian Parliament. Also in New Delhi is Abhinav Prakash Singh. He's Assistant Professor of Economics at the Shri College of Commerce. Welcome to all of you to the show. Sunil Khilnani, let's start right here in the studio and let's look at the mechanics of this election. An enormous undertaking, as we've been reporting. Voters started going to the polls on April 11th. 2,300 parties, more than 2,300 parties, 900 million people voting, 1 million polling stations. All this will only end on May 23rd when we are expecting the results. That's more than a month long. Firstly, tell us, why does it have to be this long?
Well, it's really the scale of the operation to get 800-odd million people into the polling booths is a massively complex logistical exercise. And so the Election Commission of India, which is an independent agency which conducts the Indian elections, needs the time to be able to deploy its officers and its administration to run the elections. It's also an issue of security, to be able to have enough policing to make sure that the elections are fully free and open and there's no minimal violence and so forth. So that's why it's staggered across India's 29 states in a series of phases. Of course, there's no exit polls done during the period of the election, so no one knows how the earlier stages have voted. So it's all secret ballot, as it were, until May 23rd when the results are made public. And it is really an extraordinary performance of democracy, of the idea of democracy. There's been nothing like this in history ever. Many of the people who are voting are poor. Many are not very well literate, and yet there is this great turnout. And in fact, it's the poorest, it's those at the bottom of society who are the most enthusiastic voters and participants in the process.
Sunil, the people who administer this election, I was surprised to find that they actually number in the millions as well. And this sort of caravan, this train, actually moves from one center to the next.
That's correct, and that's exactly why it has to be staged in this way. That you don't have to have so much equipment. To have it all at one go would be impossible, really. So it is like a moving caravan, and indeed, some of the polling booths are in extremely remote locations up in the mountains, in distant parts of India where normally roads or mail doesn't even reach. Right. So it is even just from the point of view of the spectacular nature of it, it's an amazing performance.
All right, let's go to New Delhi. Let's go to Subramanian Swamy. Subramanian, what are the main issues on which this election is being fought?
Well, the main issue which the BJP is making is one is national security, and the other is corruption. We are not giving much emphasis to the question of the economic issues. But the other two issues are extremely important. And I think the recent events in Sri Lanka have heightened the importance of what we have been saying, because Sri Lanka was doing economically very well, but then suddenly they found themselves in a great deal of uncertainty because of the terrorist attacks. So country needs security, and I must say, to the credit of our government, these last 5 years there hasn't been a major secure terrorist attack within the mainland of India. And the other thing is the corruption. The opposition has not been able to state any, in terms of proving any corruption of the government despite 5 years. And whereas the principal opposition leaders are out on bail in corruption charges. So this is another stark contrast between the two parties, I mean the two fronts.
Irfan, as I pointed out, more than 2,300 parties are contesting this election, but the two main parties are the BJP as well as the Congress party. What are the main differences between these two parties in what they are offering voters?
So the two main parties, as you said, the BJP and the Congress, are the main parties only because they have national presence. Right. In terms of the actual economic policies, arguably, and others might disagree, but arguably there's not much daylight between the two of them. They both tend to advocate a relatively large role for the state in the Indian economy, especially in a global comparative context. The BJP historically has been more a party of free markets, of small traders, of small business. The Congress, though, of course, was a party under which a lot of the economic reforms of the last 20 years have also been enacted. But both of them tend to be somewhat suspicious of really true free market reform, neoliberal reform. The big divergence is on the vision of the nature of Indian nationalism in Indian society. And of course, Sunil has written the book on the idea of India. He could speak more on this. But I would argue that the Congress has very much been seen as committed to a notion of a secular India in which all religions are equal members of the Indian state and of the Indian citizenry. And the BJP, especially in campaign mode, tends to espouse a much more muscular vision of Hindu nationalism, of an India rooted in a Hindu identity represented by the majority of its citizens, with maybe differing views on what exactly the role of the minority populations should be. So I would say it is more on the question of the social fabric of the country that the two parties truly diverge.
Sunil, what is your view on that? Has this nationalism that we hear espoused by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has that come at the expense of other groups in India?
Well, I think that historically and even today there are two kinds of nationalism in India. One version of nationalism, which has been the dominant one since Indian independence and indeed even before, saw India as a nation rooted in its diversity. That India's strength was the fact that it had multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple ethnicities even. And there's another vision of nationalism which is very much more shaped by Western nationalism. And that sees India as having to be defined by one single quality, a single religion or a single culture or a single dominant linguistic group or whatever. And those are, in a sense, what are dueling out today. And really at stake in this election is whether that vision of Indian nationalism, an Indian nation defined by its multiplicity, its pluralism, is one that India can sustain and grow, or whether this rather more narrow, more Western-influenced view of the Indian nation is defined by a single culture or religion will dominate.
All right, let's go to Abhinav Singh. Abhinav, Narendra Modi is a controversial politician. Some have referred to him as an Indian nationalist. He became Prime Minister in 2014. What is your view? Does he deserve another 5 years?
Well, I mean, all the politicians are controversial. Why just to talk about Narendra Modi? Opposition leaders are on bail, and I think this is the nature of the politics itself, that any politician will be controversial. The point exactly which we need to focus upon is that India is a very diverse country. You have thousands of castes, you have different languages, you have different regional differences. The party which is actually successful in Indian election is the one which is the best aggregator of the different concerns. And in the last decade, I would say the BJP has basically become the party which can aggregate different caste and communities and basically wield and weave a national narrative under Hindu nationalism or strong nationalism or maybe a corruption-free India. That is where you have the line between the success and failure being drawn in the Indian elections. We can talk about many things at the meta-narrative, but when the Indian elections happen, they come down to very local concerns. You have more than 500 constituencies, and they have their own combination, caste, religion, they have different own issues, and every election becomes a local election in the national parliament. Narendra Modi so far has been able to emerge as the only leader in the country. You can oppose him, you can support him, but he is the only leader which has a pan-Indian presence. So he is the mass leader which India has seen after Indira Gandhi. After 3 decades, this is the first mass leader which the country has seen. So of course he will be controversial because there will be lots of people who will dislike him. There will be lots of people who are going to like him. But what we need to understand that Modi is pitching his entire re-election pitch on his massive welfare schemes which he has launched in the last 5 years, like building toilets, roads, rural homes, electricity. The election is focusing basically on those issues, not as much upon the national security issue, right? It's because of Balakot strikes and the Sri Lankan attacks, the national security has suddenly become amplified in the discourse. Otherwise, he was pitching his entire thing that, well, I have opened bank accounts, I have built roads, I have increased the sanitation cover in the country. Right. So he's basically banking upon the poor people on this in this election, and we have to see what happens.
Okay, Subramanian Swamy, the leader of the opposition Congress party, Rahul Gandhi, whose grandmother, of course, Indira Gandhi, was Prime Minister, he's been very critical of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
In the past 5 years, the BJP government has worked to divide the nation and spread hatred. And you can see their record in Jammu and Kashmir. The number of casualties from terrorism keep going up. So the Congress party is going to work to bring the country together, to assimilate people and have a strong focus on national and internal security.
So, Subramanian, what do you make of those criticisms?
Well, naturally, he would like to divert the issues to something which is peripheral to the main issues. He is out on bail and a massive corruption in which the court has held him prima facie guilty along with his mother. And naturally, he would like to shift away from the issues which really concern the people. The people are worried about their security. People are worried about the corruption that they are facing. And they want answers to that. And as far as economics is concerned, whatever Modi speaks is microeconomics. The macro issues of policy, what kind of foreign direct investment policy we should follow, or the interest rates, how high or low they should be, those macro issues are not being debated by anybody today in the campaign. And because they know that in the past, those prime ministers who have performed very brilliantly in economics, in macroeconomics, they have not been re-elected. The classic example is Mr. Narasimha Rao, who brought in major reforms in our economy and gave up socialism. He was defeated very badly. His party came to half the strength. Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee of my party, who was widely liked for his liberal attitudes and so on, he had consistently maintained that only that counts is economics. And he, in fact, advanced the elections by 6 months, thinking that he will get a sweep. And he called it, his slogan was India Shining. Yeah. But he ended up with half the numbers he had before. So I think India still is a nation in making, in the sense that people are discovering how united we are and how united we have been. Yeah. And they would like to hear these nationalistic themes much more than anything else.
Irfan, sorry, you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that it seems to me that actually economic issues are very much important, and people are going to vote on that much more than I think national security issues. I mean, the national security issues might be what concern people in Delhi and in some of the kind of small circles of India's elites. But for most people, it's actually getting a job, and that's something that this current government came in promising to do. Mr. Modi, when he was elected in 2014 and campaigned then, was promising jobs to Indians, and that hasn't happened. And I think that's going to be something that is going to be very much on the minds of voters as they vote over these next weeks.
Subramanian, isn't that a good point? The jobless numbers in India are not very good,
I would like to add-
6.1% right now.
Well, you know, it would have been a good issue, but for the fact that the Alternative Congress was in power for about 60 years, and they haven't made any dent on unemployment, haven't generated any great employment. So the people would regard this, okay, Modi has got only one term, and let's give him another term and see whether he will do it. But you know, the Congress has no way that they can make a point on economics. They can go on saying it, but the mere fact is that they are not able to answer what did they do for 60 years, because the same problems have existed from the beginning.
Right. Irfan, do you agree that, you know, people, I guess in any country, when they vote like this, vote on pocketbook issues, don't they?
They do. And in a poor country, in a country of young people, that's something we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
Most of the voters of the 900 million that you mentioned are actually voters voting in their first, maybe their second election, because 700 million Indians are under the age of 27. So in any poor country, people want jobs, they care about pocketbook issues. But for young people who are imagining starting their own lives, their futures, it is especially true. So pocketbook issues are critical, jobs are critical. Farmers' distress and rural economy issues are central in a way that has always been true. And we want to wait, we keep wanting for an India that's debating FDI and industrial policy, but farmer issues are central. The country still relies on agriculture to occupy the work of half of its population. The key issue, and I agree with Dr. Swamy on this, is that microeconomics, the policy, the welfare schemes is what is debated, but India needs macroeconomic reforms. It needs a new generation of economic reforms if we're going to solve the unemployment crisis. He's probably right that people are willing to give the current government another chance, 5 years, let's see what they can do. But there's also no question that the promises made in 2014, which the BJP is not campaigning on in 2019, it is noticeable to a lot of voters that the party that promised good days, Achhe Din, is not talking about that set of achievements now.
Abhinav, let's talk about the farm constituency in India. Farmers, half the workforce in India are made up of farmers. They are facing rising costs right now. Prices of their crops are dropping all the time. What is the government offering them?
Well, this is a very serious problem in India, that how do you move from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy? And what we have seen over the last couple of years is that the government has been trying to promote manufacturing and industries, but somehow that is not really picking up because of the issues in land acquisition basically, and lots of environmental laws and the protest by the people in giving up their land. So what the government has done in the last 2-3 years that we can see in the budget is that it is trying to address the farmer concern by giving them the direct benefit transfer. So there's a direct cash transfer which is going to the farmers now, and which has to a large extent taken away lots of dissatisfaction with the government. It was announced in the last budget, but the government has been able to manage that thing, and it has also promised the higher support price and all those things to the farmers. But the point is that in India, no party really have the solution to the agrarian crisis, because we have a huge population trying to make out a living out of a very small parcel of the land. The focus should lie on basically making it more industrialized, and the government has promised in the manifesto, the Modi has promised in the manifesto that they are going to massively increase the investment in the infrastructure and the industry, something which is opposition is also promising. But it seems that the people have more trust in the stable government, and they have more trust in the ability of the Modi to deliver than on the ability of the Rahul Gandhi. That is visible on the ground, that people say, well, okay, both of them are promising the same thing basically, they're talking the same stuff beyond the rhetoric, but who is more trustworthy? So I think in that case, even the rural population is banking more on the Modi. But as I said, there are lots of local issues which tend to determine the election. So in some belt, you have the sugarcane issue. In the other belt, you have the issue of the cotton farmers. And how do you do that? That becomes the outcome.
Yes, one has to make some inductive inference from the past elections. Yeah. Mrs. Gandhi had once declared a state of emergency and suspended the constitution. Yeah. And she said it was for, first of all, to clear up the dirt in the country, as well as do some major economic changes. And there were some changes, I would say. There was, in terms of statistics of the production for the 2 years, she had produced some very good results. But when the elections came, the poorest part of India, namely the North Indian states, they voted massively against the Congress party, and they defeated Mrs. Gandhi in her own constituency. Yeah. Now, how do you explain that? Right. I mean, Mrs. Gandhi had done a lot for her constituency. So on her constituency alone, she should have won her one seat if all that mattered was economics. The people took the deprivation of human rights or their personal rights or their fundamental rights so seriously.
Okay. Okay, Sunil, I want to talk about another important constituency in India. That's women. Women make up 25% of the workforce in India. How decisive a role do you think they will play in this election?
Well, I think a very important role. I mean, women are now voting freely and independently.
They're swing voters, aren't they?
Yes, there's they certainly, there's not any clear, unlike say in some European countries where women tend to vote more conservatively, you know, Catholic countries and so on. That's not the case in India. Often they are very much voting for kind of non-traditional views. But the thing about women in India is really two things. One, their underrepresentation in the labor force. So not enough Indian women are working in the Indian economy. But secondly, they do tend to be very, well represented in democratic elections and in voting, not sufficiently in terms of candidates, but in terms of participating in the vote, and they will be an important element. And it's not a clear. One can't predict in advance how they're going to vote. They vote as individuals rather than as a group or as members of communities and so on. But I would just come back to Dr. Swamy's point.
May I speak on
one moment? I'll get back to you in a moment.
I think that he's right that at the end of the day, Indian voters value their freedom and their liberties, and that's what they're voting for. And in that sense, I think they also value the pluralism of Indian society above all. But I think this idea that that you have to, in a sense, Mr. Modi needs more time. Well, of course, every government needs more time to bring about its economic changes. But the fact is that even in the 5 years that have happened, much of what he's promised was actually not implemented. And some of the things that he did do have been negative on the Indian economy, such as demonetization in 2017, which had a massive negative effect on the economy. So some of his great new initiatives have actually been bad. So it seems to me that voters actually will make their judgments on that too, not just on what he hasn't done, but on what he's done and where that's been negative.
Irfan, I want to get to some other issues in this election as well. Muslims are India's biggest minority. They make up 14% of the country's population, but their representation in parliament is barely 4%. And that, if you look at some comparative figures, that compares with 6% a decade ago and a high of 9.6%, almost 10% in 1980. What's changed?
Well, in many ways, what's changed is that the BJP is far more a national party that's winning a lot of seats, but that doesn't nominate Muslim candidates on any of its tickets. So if you look down the list of candidates nominated by the BJP across these 543 constituencies, you'd be hard-pressed to find more than a handful of Muslim candidates. The Congress is not much better. It does slightly better, but it doesn't do much better, partly because the electoral arithmetic means that running a Muslim candidate against a Hindu candidate potentially loses you a seat. So what has happened is that the Muslim representation in parliament is coming from parties that have essentially co-opted or captured the Muslim vote in very Muslim-dominated constituencies. And the major parties have effectively shared in the marginalization of Muslim candidates to parliament. It's a shocking indictment of India's promise to its minority populations. The issue is not much better on gender. I mean, both parties across all of these 500 constituencies have nominated not more than 30 women each in the two major parties for tickets in this current election. So the truth of the matter is that India's parliament no longer looks like the Indian nation. This is true, of course, in lots of parts of the world, but for India, it is something it's going to have to remedy. the marginalization of the Muslim population is also seen in voter turnout. I mean, the city of Bombay is voting today across its 6 Lok Sabha seats, the city of Mumbai, and Muslim turnout is lower than one might have imagined. And part of that has to be understood as being apathy, because they don't hear any of these parties really speaking to their concerns.
Abhinav, go ahead.
See, one of the reasons why Muslim representation is declining in the parliament and the legislature is that now more and more Muslims are contesting election. You can see the number of Muslim candidates has increased. So you have a Muslim dominated area, you have now dozens of candidates from the Muslim community. What happens, the vote gets split among those candidates. So what happens that the other parties and the non-Muslim candidate basically gets the benefit of those things. So it's not the apathy, the participation in the democratic process has actually increased. What is happening is the technical issues of getting the sufficient number of votes to win the election. And on the gender point, I would like to say that the Modi has actually cultivated his constituency in the last 5 years. He has given more than 70 million gas cylinders. He has targeted his the toilet construction program and his sanitation coverage program specifically on the women. And he has also channeled billions of dollars through the self-help groups, which basically goes to the women. So I think in these both things, gender and the Muslim community vote, they have very important role to play, but the Muslim vote so far has remained split over the last couple of elections. What we need to see whether it gets consolidated behind a party or not, which I don't think is happening, because Muslim vote is not a monolith in India.
All right.
You have different communities and caste among the Muslims who vote differently.
Subramanian Swamy, one final issue I want to look at, and that is foreign policy. And we do know that people don't normally vote on foreign policy wherever an election takes place. But India might be unique in one respect, and that is its relationship with its neighbor to the north, Pakistan. Does that feature in this election at all?
The only foreign policy that gets discussed in Indian elections is Pakistan. And generally speaking, the Indian population is wants friendship with America, because many Indians have gone there and prospered there, and it's democracy and so many other commonalities. But at the same time, we don't want to be part of the camp of the Americans.
Okay.
So I don't think it's an issue. There's not much, except that Pakistan, we have tried to make out that Congress is very pro-Pakistan, and that's hurt them, I think.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.